Good afternoon, Anthony. In this podcast, we'll be going through a video clip of a pair of hippos interacting in the Letaba River just outside Shimuwini Rest Camp in the northern Kruger National Park. Looking forward to delving into hippo biology as we watch these two individuals have a scrap. The scrap lasted for over an hour, but this clip is 8 minutes of the interaction clipped out of that hour-long argument between these two animals. So should I click the play button?
Yes, please. Let's have a look at it and see what we can find. Can you pause for a second, please, Anthony?
Sure.
It's interesting that right from the start, we can see two interesting species of birds in close proximity to the animals in question. There's the yellow-billed oxpecker on the backs of the animals, and there's a hammerkop down in the stream. And we can perhaps comment on those birds in more detail later, but it struck me how even in the sort of hectic action of the conflict, the yellow-billed oxpecker remains on the back of one of the animals at least.
Yes.
Okay, let's carry on. Pause again, please, Anthony. In a sequence like this, the first question one asks is, what is the sex of the two individuals of the common hippopotamus? And immediately this becomes problematic because even the most experienced field naturalists who have long experience with the hippo battle to distinguish the sexes most of the time, which seems inept and puzzling. But this is one of the most interesting features of the biology of the common hippopotamus, is that most male individuals in a population are not different enough from females to be very easy to tell the sex of. And that raises a whole topic about what the real sociosexual nature of the common hippopotamus is, which we can comment on now, but later on. But at the moment, I'm just having a look and trying to make up my mind whether these are females or males. I think because of the context, we should have the default assumption that they are adult but not fully mature males, and that what they're basically doing is rehearsing territorial defense behavior, even though it's unlikely that they actually possess territories. So as a bit of background to that, one of the peculiarities of hippo society is that there are remarkably few territory holders in a group. Like, for example, you can have a stretch of river that has hundreds of individuals of the hippo all living cheek by jowl in it. And there will only be a few territory holders who have territories spanning the water and the bank of the river. And these will always be males, and the territories give the males mating priority. But what's remarkable is that most males get cut out. In a given population, at least 90% of the adult males don't see any action because they don't hold territories. And what they do is they're completely subordinate to the territory holding males. And as long as they're subordinate, they get on fabulously. There's no friction. But at the same time, something that's not been written about in the studies of the sociosexual biology of the common hippopotamus is that presumably the sexually non-active, non-territorial individuals of the male population must be rehearsing their territorial behavior, because otherwise, how would they be able to do it if and when they luck out and manage to get a territory? So I presume it's kind of instinctive in these males to rehearse the kind of rather ritualized standoffs that you find among territory holders. You see what I'm saying? So this is I suspect that this behavior could be classified more as play than as serious, in the same way that most behaviorists who have studied play in animals and humans acknowledge that play is actually a rehearsal of something that later on becomes serious in a different context. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. So it's unlikely that either of these animals would be wounded seriously in such an interaction, especially considering that the dominant male could prevail for decades. So you need your play to be very gentle over 2 decades before you actually have the real fight with the dominant male. Would you agree?
I would agree with that, but it's even more interesting than that, because you see, in the common hippopotamus, male-male antagonism takes 2 forms. One is maintenance of the territory boundary by mutual acknowledgement with the adjacent territory holder, and that's largely a ritualized pattern without much violence. It's like everybody's testing everybody else, and there's a face-off and a bit of fencing and a bit of posturing, but the whole idea is not to overcome anyone. It's just to maintain the status quo. And if one of the territory holders has lost condition and has lost confidence and is maybe ailing or lame, then that will be divulged in that rather ritualized territory boundary. I wouldn't call it a dispute, but it's almost like a greeting ceremony. Now, if and when there's a genuine challenge to a long-standing territory holder, the completely different kind of antagonism arises, because then it gets serious. And what the animals do is they don't face off as we see them doing here, but they stand reverse parallel. In other words, they stand right next to each other, facing in opposite directions, side to side, and then they rake at each other violently with their lower canines, inflicting long gashes on the skin. And that's serious stuff. That's the kind of situation where a territory might change hands. And we're expressly not seeing anything like that here. So this is my best guess, that although these look as if they could be females based on their body proportions, they're probably adult, but not fully mature males. They're probably not territory holders. In other words, they're bachelors, but they're semi-seriously and semi-playfully rehearsing territory maintaining behavior. That would be my best. Yeah.
Should I press play to watch?
Yes, please.
Some more of this interaction.
Let's see what they do. And pause. Here we see a kind of a ritualized yawning behavior. I suppose you shouldn't call it yawning, but it's a fang-bearing. It certainly is a fang-bearing expression or fang-bearing behavior, which is thoroughly characteristic of the common hippopotamus, in which the mouth is opened wide, with the upper jaw being hoisted high, and displaying mainly the lower canines. So you can see these long, impressive canine teeth, a pair of canine teeth on the lower jaw. And this is a little bit interesting because the hippo has rather piggy little eyes, and it's tempting to assume that because the eyes are relatively small in the hippo, the animal doesn't see particularly well. But I guess we have to assume that the main function of the fang-bearing display is to display the intactness and sharpness and length of the lower canines. And I suppose that the hippo's eyesight is perfectly good enough to see that well. And you can see this fang-bearing display behavior, this yawning mechanism operating in all ages and sexes of the hippo, including juveniles, females. They all do this. They all seem to show off their lower canine teeth, usually without much violence. It's a bit like baboons. The males of the various species of baboons all do this as well. They have this what appears to be just like a casual yawn, a very wide yawn, but it makes the size, condition, and sharpness of the upper canines in the case of baboons very clear to everyone around. So it's a kind of a continual reassurance of the other members of the group that the male in question is perfectly well armed still, thank you very much, and as long as nobody gets too uppity, there can be peace in the group. So what's interesting here is that the left-hand individual of these two males is showing off his fangs, his fang-bearing, showing off the lower canines, and the right one is more in a kind of a protestation mode. So the left one is basically not doing much work, just showing off its teeth. And the right-hand one it's almost like it's doing displacement behavior. And then this raises the question of what are the vocalizations here? Because it's very easy to assume that this whole interaction is silent. But those who have studied hippos know that the hippo is a very garrulous animal. It's very vocal, very loud, possibly also in infrasound, which human beings can't hear. And it's often very loud and with a very varied vocal repertoire underwater. And so I suspect that these animals are shouting at each other. And some of it is audible in the form of perhaps squealing or whining on the part of the animal on the right. But that much of what they're saying to each other may not be audible to the human ear in this context here. So I suspect that the interaction is more auditory than visual, even though there's an obvious visual component. And we may see later that there's also evidence for an olfactory communication among them. So I guess the point I'm making is that characteristic yawn of the common hippo that you see on the in the individual on the left is spectacular and distracting. It's one of the most spectacular fang-bearing displays of any animal in the world. But I suspect that in the full context, it's not a particularly important part of the overall display, which may well be equally communicative in terms of auditory and olfactory signaling in this species.
Okay, and do you think the one on the right seems to be more submissive? Do you think this play fighting, they're adopting different roles? One a submissive role, pretending to be submissive, and the other one pretending to be the dominant aggressor. Because ultimately, if they get their turn to spar with the big bull, they may have to figure out how to play both those roles. You know, if the big bull wants to exert his dominance, then all males in the herd need to know how to behave submissively. So do you think there's a role play of one being submissive and one being dominant, or do you think there's a pecking order amongst the bachelors in the herd?
Well, that question of a pecking order is open. I don't think that the various people who've studied the hippo in the field know the answer to that question. The impression you get from the literature is that there's no pecking order in most of the adult males or in most of the adult females in in your typical group of the common hippopotamus.
Yeah.
But we can't say that for sure. And as for the question of rehearsing submissive behavior, yes, that's plausible. But what we're seeing here is not really indicative of the full submissive repertoire because, for example, when a truly mature, a large-headed, large-jawed, territorial male is out there grazing at night, and he's approached by other males, they're extremely submissive. They come forward with their heads lowered. Sometimes they almost crawl towards him. They make it very clear that they're groveling. Yeah. And as long as they grovel, the powerful territorial male is completely benign towards them. Often just seems to ignore them, but tolerates them completely with no bullying at all.
Okay.
So yes, submissive behavior is extremely important. But and we know that from observations. But what we don't know is whether all of these potentially sexually active but still largely celibate adult males in the population who happen not to have had the good fortune of scoring a territory, we don't know whether they show any submission or dominance over each other. It's one of the more interesting questions. It's very difficult to observe hippos clearly enough to determine such things.
Right.
So, but what we do see in this particular pair is a clear asymmetry. The one on the left is far more it's more relaxed, except for its rather persistent fang-bearing expression, whereas the one on the right is doing all sorts of strange things, not clearly submissive, but in a different kind of a mode, as it were.
Yeah. Okay. Should I continue?
Yes, please. Just to pause again. A few seconds ago, two interesting things happened. One is that the relatively protesting individual on the right splashed water in the face of the fang-bearing individual.
Yeah.
Followed by them both lowering their noses and just holding their noses close to each other. And also, the individual on the left wagged its tail. And when it did that, I was on the lookout to see if the vulva was visible, because I suspect that when the tail is wagged, and if it's an adult female, you might be able to see that there's a vulva there, as opposed to just the anus of the male. But I didn't really get a clear view. My impression is that the area beneath the tail confirms that these are males rather than females. But anyway, it's interesting that the one on the right splashed the one on the left, because obviously a hippo is not going to be irritated by having water splashed on its face. And so you wonder why it does that, and maybe it's a way of olfactory communication. Having the water in the mouth. Yeah.
And there are reports of hippos spitting at one another or at predators, splashing saliva. Is that right, or is that just purely anecdotal?
I've read two things in that connection. One is that part of the territorial ritual does involve splashing. It's recorded, and that's actually among real territory holders. And secondly, there are some intriguing reports of the common hippopotamus in a situation where it's threatened by the lion, seeming to spit towards the lions. But it's just a brief anecdote that I've read, and I haven't got any more details. So the possibility of spitting in the hippo is one of those questions that's still uninvestigated.
And the birds reappear, more birds, grey heron and Goliath heron.
Yes,
the oxpeckers seem to have moved off, but I think they return a bit later. Should we continue?
Yes, let's continue. And pause again.
Okay.
I see the yellow-billed oxpeckers are back on the individual on the right. Here's a
Yes.
subtle and intriguing point about the common hippopotamus. You'll notice that the whites of the eyes are visible on both partners here.
Yes.
And that's particularly noticeable because, as everybody realizes, the eyes of the common hippopotamus are sort of housed in orbits that project above the dorsal line of the head. But it's difficult to say whether this eye white display is functional in the hippo, because it could just be a function of the fact that the eyeball is rather small and fits rather loosely into the orbit, so that the white sclera just simply shows to an extent greater than you see in most other ungulates.
Yeah.
So I just don't know what to think about that, but certainly the common hippopotamus is unusual among ungulates in how much it shows the whites of its eyes.
So there may be communication going on between the hippos in terms of staring at one another and the eye whites helping them work out in what direction the animal's looking, much like occurs in humans.
I wouldn't go that far. I would be extremely surprised if there's any kind of detailed communication going on by means of the whites of the eyes.
Okay.
My suspicion would be that the eye white display is actually non-functional in the hippo and is just an accidental result of of two things. Number one is that the default tone of the sclera in mammals generally is white.
Okay.
It's white in rats, it's white in marsupials, it's white in most mammals. But only in those mammals that have rather small eyes set rather loosely into rather large orbits do you actually see the whites of the eyes. And unless there's a special software program, a neural program for reading attention and intention in the form of eye movements, then it's most unlikely that the animals are actually getting much communication value out of that.
Okay.
But in humans, you've got something similar in humans, but it's much more meaningful in humans because we have the brains and the software settings to read a lot into each other's eye white movements. So the bottom line is, all I'm pointing out is that unlike most other ungulates, you can see a lot of eye white in the hippo, and that's just interesting to note.
Yep.
And now that they're holding their noses close to each other, I can't help but think that there's either olfactory communication going on where they blow, they basically exhaling on each other to communicate by means of olfaction in an honest way, because the breath will tell them a lot about each other's hormonal status and immune system and so forth, in an animal like the hippo, which can presumably smell much better than we can. And the other possibility is that although there's not much sound coming out of these animals, they're communicating in infrasound, both above water and below water, because as you can see, part of the jaw is below the water. So, and the animals could be hearing what's going on below the water, even though their ears are well above water, because of communication from water level up through the jaw bones to the inner ear bones. So there seems to be a kind of a quiet moment in this interaction, but it could actually be quite full of information, both olfactory and auditory, in a way that has yet to be researched.
Absolutely. The squeals and the roars and the grunts were certainly loud for a large portion of the hour, but there were moments of silence as they stared at one another from millimeters away, as in this still shot. Should I continue?
Yes, please continue.
Okay.
I see, just pause a second. I see now there's a blacksmith plover that's entered the scene,
Yes.
foraging in the foreground. Yeah. Visitors, viewers will get a pretty clear view of the lower canines in some of these sequences. And so it's interesting to think about how the lower canines function in the common hippopotamus. They're lethal-looking teeth. And at first glance, they look like an inverted version of a carnivore's tooth. Like, for example, most carnivora have large upper canines. And the impression here is that the hippo is like a carnivore in the relative size of its canines, except that they're on the lower jaw instead of the upper jaw. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because in the common hippopotamus, unlike any member of the carnivora, as far as I know, there's a honing mechanism that keeps the lower canines sharp in a way that's truly terrifying, because it's not just a case of keeping it sharp at the tip. It's also keeping it sharp as a kind of a blade, in the sense that there's a wear facet in which the upper canine wears against the lower one continually. And the canine teeth are ever growing. They don't have closed roots, they have open roots, and so they grow throughout the life of the animal, a bit like a rodent's incisors. And as far as we know, the only function of the canine teeth in the common hippopotamus is antagonism. They're not used for foraging at all, but they are used to, except possibly, occasionally the common hippopotamus has been observed killing animals that are in the water, like perhaps an impala that's taking refuge from the African hunting dog. Sometimes the common hippopotamus will kill the animal and partly eat it. And sometimes the hippo has been recorded scavenging carcasses near the water's edge. So there is some eating of meat, and I don't know the degree to which the canines would be used in killing prey in those circumstances, but pretty incidental. So the canine teeth are essentially anti-predator teeth. And the sort of display of the canines in this fang-bearing expression here, particularly in the animal on the left, is purely ritualized. Because in this kind of interaction, it's most unlikely that that canine tooth is going to be used on the other partner.
Right, because the canines can't be used effectively against another hippo, given the size of the hippo. They can't get the canines into the flesh, whereas for perhaps those canines are ideal for slicing a crocodile or a lion or a hyena. It's all about the positioning of the canines relative to the size of the body they're trying to slice. Is that right?
Yes, there is that. There's also another interesting thing. The individual on the left could potentially bite down on the muzzle of the one on the right.
Okay.
And injure it quite badly that way. So that's
right.
The one place where those canines could be used. There seems to be a behavioral inhibition, because when two male individuals antagonize each other, they tend to have a repertoire in which they open their mouths wide and then kind of lock the front of the lower jaw of one individual against that of the other. And that's where the horizontally directed lower incisors come in, and they use those lower incisor teeth, which are a bit like mini versions of elephant tusks, as a way of sort of locking and engaging, and then they push and they wrestle with each other using the front of their lower jaw without attempting to use the canines. And so I think they're behaviorally wired to be inhibited about biting down on each other's faces using the canines, because it'd be quite easy in a situation to just to take a bite, and then there would be a lot of damage, because you see an individual in the fang-bearing expression with its mouth wide open could easily take the whole upper jaw or muzzle of the other individual into its mouth and bite it severely.
So this is a case of mutually assured destruction, preventing the use of the weapon.
Yes, I think that's right. Yes, because I've
Mm.
never seen a photograph of a hippopotamus with any serious puncture wounds on the muzzle. One does see
Okay.
bleeding around the gums on the lower jaw. That is consistent with them fencing with the lower incisors.
Okay.
But the main point for listeners and viewers to note is how complex and mysterious the dentition of the common hippopotamus is. We still don't fully understand how these awe-inspiring and complicated teeth work.
And the sparring, the fencing with the lower incisors, is it predominantly with the territorial bull, or do you think these subordinates could also fence?
I couldn't comment on the latter point, but it is known that when territorial fully mature males go through their ritual of testing each other, maintaining the territory boundary, and kind of keeping the status quo, they do exactly that. They engage the lower jaw, the front of the lower jaw, one on the other.
Okay.
They interlock those incisors, often breaking them, by the way. In fact, that's the main. See, the lower incisors, which have more or less a similar dentine composition to the tusks of an elephant, those are also ever growing, just like the canines. But unlike the canines, they don't have a wear facet. So just to review, the canines, which are those vertically directed fang-like teeth that you see in this sequence, they have continual growth throughout life. But that's very understandable in the same way that the ever-growing incisors of a rat are understandable, because the upper canine wears against the lower canine continually. And so the fact that they're ever-growing makes perfect sense, because that's how the self-sharpening mechanism works, by means of a wear facet that keeps those canines lethal, not only as an impaling tooth, but also as a slicing tooth, a bit like garden shears. When it comes to the lower incisors, they're blunt at the tips. They're ever-growing. They don't have a wear facet. They're not worn out against anything else. And so one wonders why you don't see hippos wandering around that have these long tusks sticking out of the mouth, horizontal to the ground. And the main reason for that seems to be that in these jostles with each other, they're continually breaking off bits of those incisors.
Okay.
And that does imply that the non-territorial males in the population must be doing that in a kind of playful way or in a rehearsing way, because otherwise they would have lower incisors sticking right out of their mouths conspicuously, and you never see that. I've never seen a single individual that has the lower canines projecting out beyond the lips.
And the females and their incisors, are they?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I've never seen that point raised in the literature. It's amazing how when you start thinking about things in a consistent way, all kinds of questions pop up that you've never seen referred to before. Because as far as I know, both the females and the males have ever-growing lower incisors, and in neither case is there a wear facet. The upper and the lower canines, incisors do engage. You know, when the mouth is closed, they engage in a kind of a locking mechanism that explains why when the common hippopotamus chews its food, its jaws move back and forth, not side to side as in most other ungulates.
Okay.
So one of the kind of side functions, as it were, of that incisor mechanism is that it keeps the jaw from moving side to side. But that doesn't really seem to explain why they're there in the first place. And so I don't know. I guess we have to assume that that all adult members of the population at times lock incisors with each other, maybe in squabbles, and that they keep breaking off little bits of the incisors, explaining why the incisors keep growing. But it's a mystery. It's a mystery.
Okay, should we look for some more mysteries? Shall I press play?
Yes, please. Yeah. Oh, if you could pause, please, Anthony. This might be a good time to discuss what these animals would be looking like if they were actual territory-holding males. The fully mature male in the form of a territory holder becomes larger than most of the males in the population. And it has a particularly disproportionately large head. And in turn, the head has particular disproportional massiveness in the lower jaw, including the lower canine. So the main secondary sexual characteristic of the common hippopotamus in the form of its masculinity is in the head. The head becomes massive, and particularly the lower jaws become massive. And that's an odd combination. It's different from most other ungulates. So it's all about the lower jaw. But that whole repertoire of having a massive head, which is quite visible in a specimen, as long as it's, as long as the head's visible, you can usually see that it's a fully mature male. That additional growth over and above just simply growth to adulthood only seems to occur once the male in question has acquired a territory and then has the sort of hormonal regime in his body that triggers that additional growth, which then, that additional growth then perpetuates the tenure of the territory holder, because it gives him a set of armaments that distinguishes him from most of the other males in the population. So we can't illustrate that what those fully mature males look like here, but if viewers go to the web and search carefully, for example, among the photos in iNaturalist, you'll find perhaps the occasional photograph that clearly shows a fully mature male with his massive head and his massive lower jaw.
So it's a similar setup to orangutans, where the dominant male looks quite different to the subordinates, and that can last for years. There's an analogy there?
There is an analogy there which has never been suggested in the literature. Yes, this occurred to us, you and me, recently in discussing this, but I don't think anybody else has thought of that. And yes, let's review for viewers what that means. In orangutans, most males in the population, again, do not achieve their full set of secondary sexual characteristics, and they may remain in that rather suppressed state for many years and possibly their whole lives if they happen not to become top dog in the population. But those lucky males that do become top dog in the population then undergo an extra sequence of growth that transforms their faces and necks tremendously by the growth of grotesque flanges on the sides of the face, and an obvious throat pouch, and also a change in the voice box. So the head honcho, you wouldn't call them silverbacks, but they're analogous to silverbacks. The head honcho male orangutans in a population who have most of the mating rights, they look quite different from all of the other members of the population because they have this additional grotesque growth on and near the head, which is analogous to what happens in the hippopotamus. And the way it works is that, again, it's a case of there's nothing that succeeds like success, you see. because for whatever reason, if an orangutan does achieve superiority in the hierarchy of his population, then the hormonal changes that facilitate additional secondary sexual characteristics tend to perpetuate his reign. And there's no real zoological term for this. If you look in the web, you'll see that people refer to the orangutans as having so-called sexual bimaturism. But when you look up in Wikipedia what the definition of bimaturism is, you'll find it's rather self-contradictory and inconsistent. So we do need a better term for it, or else we need to define bimaturism in a strict way. And if defined in that strict way, I think bimaturism would still possibly apply to the common hippopotamus in a way that's not been noticed by researchers until now. And if that's true, then there are only two animals, two genera of animals in the entire world that have this narrowly defined sexual bimaturism, and those would be pongo, the orangutans, and hippopotamus, the common hippopotamus.
One of the advantages for the subordinate males is that they look similar to females, so they can potentially hide in amongst the females and still have some mating opportunities under the watch of the dominant male, who is unable to pick them out as threats to his mating dominance.
Well, you could frame it that way, but I would doubt that he is that unobservant. The way I would put it is as follows: it's not that those males who have not yet fully expressed their masculinity are so effeminate that they fool the head honcho male. It's more that as long as they remain completely subordinate to him, he's perfectly tolerant of them. And given that subordination, they then have an opportunity to try to get the occasional sneaky copulation. Because females of most species, including polygynous species, in which most of the matings are monopolized by a few successful males, most of these societies do have irregular cheating matings as a kind of a genetic hedge betting. In the same way that, monogamous birds that marry for life still occasionally cheat on each other in a way that's almost comical, because you can see the deceit and the guilt and the furtiveness about it. So yes, it's quite possible that the occasional mating happens in a population of a common hippopotamus in which a completely unsuccessful male who doesn't have a territory manages somehow to take advantage and have a quick mating with a female. But his getting away with it would not be a function of him mimicking females as much as him just simply maintaining his P's and Q's and remaining completely submissive to the territorial male at the time. Does that make sense?
It does. Looking at it another way, I suppose it's just impractical for the dominant male to run around admonishing all the other males that are having sneaky copulations. He rather just tolerates that, and perhaps 20 or 30% of the females are not inseminated by him, but at least he's getting 70%. Does that ring true? I can't see how he would enforce that discipline across the whole herd.
No, I think the way you described it is absolutely spot on. I mean, if you think about it, you can have a population of 200 individuals of the common hippopotamus sharing a single stretch of a river or a lakeside, and in that population there may be only a few territorial males. They can't possibly watch all the males in their area and then rush over and interrupt anything that goes on. There's just not enough time and energy for that kind of thing. And similarly, everybody goes out to graze lawns at night. Everybody has to do that because that's where the hippo gets its food, is out there on dry land at night. And if a particular female returns after her initial foraging bout to the water, And if some subordinate male does the same thing, then they probably have hours of opportunity to mate, while the mature territorial male is out there on the pastures grazing because he needs to fill up his belly. And it's worth mentioning that when they're out there on the pastures at night grazing, there's no territoriality whatsoever. There's no attempt to defend any patch of grass. And there's very little antagonism. Everybody's just trying to fill up their belly and get back to the water where their safety lies. So if you think about it, there's plenty of opportunity for sneaky matings. And I think the way you've put it is correct, which is that what the male achieves is priority, but not exclusivity.
Okay. But this is not documented in the literature as far as you're aware. Hippos are deemed to be animals that the males only get a chance to mate once they become the territorial bull. Is that the general impression?
Yes, that's the picture that's presented in the literature. And in that context, what is odd about the common hippopotamus compared to the many other polygynous ungulates that also have large males that maintain territories is that the tenure of the territories in the common hippopotamus is surprisingly long. You can have a particular fully mature male hippopotamus with its huge head and jowls that keeps its territory literally for years, sometimes for decades, and it's that persistence that's surprising. And I think that persistence or that durability of the territorial tenure goes hand in hand with this phenomenon of sexual bimaturism, because you see, once success breeds success, as it were, and his hormonal mechanism kicks in to give him that additional bulk and that the additional size of his canines, then he's almost impossible to depose. You see.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing kind of fits together coherently.
Okay. So assuming these are two males, they could be battling like this for decades before they get a chance to rule the roost over the river. Should we continue watching them?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Just pause there. We're getting a particularly clear view of the hind end, and you can see the tail moving side to side, exposing the anus.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that's a male.
Okay.
One would have to have a good look at both male and female, but yeah, it looks like a male to me.
Right. Okay. We have about 4 minutes more of this clip.
Okay. Shall we just proceed? Let's power it. Just pause for a second. Right now is the only time in the whole 8-minute sequence where you can see something that looks like the penis on the male on the left. You see that little pink dangling bit?
Yes.
I think that's the penis. That's where the penis is likely to be found.
Right.
Obviously, there's no scrotum in the common hippopotamus any more than there is in the various elephants, because the testes are internal.
Yeah.
And the penis is not large in the hippopotamus, but it is visible if you get the animal in the right angle. Anyway, please do continue.
Okay.
Again, pause for a second. I don't know if other viewers get this impression, but when I watch this kind of behavior in the common hippopotamus, I get an impression of stupidity, which is consistent with the small brains of the species. The common hippopotamus has about half the brain mass or volume that you'd expect for an ungulate of its body mass. But you see, that could be misleading because it could be that there's a lot going on that we don't perceive here. In terms of the visual aspects of the antagonism, it seems dumb and somewhat boring, but it could be that there's a lot going on auditorily and olfactorily, and people have studied the vocalizations of the hippo, so we do know that they are complex and fascinating in the sense of being transmitted both above and below the water level. But in the case of smell, I don't think the hippopotamus has been studied at all. And we have to ask ourselves, well, how acute is the olfactory sense in this animal? I don't know. But I think we have to assume that it's much better than ours. And it could be that a lot of this interaction here, where they have their heads close by, is them smelling each other. And if so, a lot of information about hormonal status, health, immune system, and so on could be exchanged in that way.
Right, so we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg, as it were, with our human senses.
That's right. And even, you know, when you look at the territory contesting battles among males, the sorts of contests that actually decide whether a particular territory is going to change hands or not, and this is nothing like that we're watching now. The fact that the males stand reverse parallel next to each other, but facing in opposite directions, side by side, and then rake at each other with their lower canines, producing these bloody gashes on the side of the body, that could also be a test of the immune system rather than an attempt to wound the animal, because in the common hippopotamus, those kinds of skin wounds heal remarkably fast, considering that the animal is lolling in dirty water and fecal contaminated water all day and much of the night. There seems to be a fantastic immune system involving the healing of the skin, assisted or perhaps retarded by the attention of the two species of oxpeckers, which love to nibble at the wounds and drink blood as well as bite off little bits of flesh. But the oxpeckers may actually be helping in the sense that they remove necrotic tissue and actually clean up the wound. So we don't really know how the oxpeckers and the leeches help or hinder. But you see, the point I'm trying to make is that the rather gory and spectacular battles among potentially territorial males in the serious type of contest could mainly be a test of the immune system, because they rake each other, basically from shoulder to haunch repeatedly. And then if an animal is kind of getting a little old or has lost some of its hormonal strength, as it were, and its immune system falters, then that's going to matter, because the animal will lose condition after having been wounded in that way. Does that make any sense?
No, it's a fascinating angle, and it strikes me that hippos are a bit like humans in terms of the rules of the game and the fight. One thing you could imagine is just all-out wrestling where they're trying to slice each other with their canines, trying to bite the muzzle, trying to kill one another. That's like a street fight where anything goes. You can knife your opposition, you can shoot them, you can punch them wherever. That's a human street fight, till the death. Whereas what you're describing sounds a bit more like a civilized boxing fight, if you can call boxing civilized, but you're only allowed to punch at a certain time and in a certain place, and they're hard and fast rules to prevent death and serious injury. But yes, over time, the it's a bacteria that might kill the animal. or at least show how that the bull has weakened.
Well, that's right, because if your immune system is faltering, then that's a way in which you terminate this long-standing kind of success breeds success superiority of your condition over all of your rivals. And it's kind of going out with a whimper rather than with a bang, because all that happens is you weaken,
Yeah.
Your immune system falters, the wounds take a little longer to heal, it just debilitates you, and then at the next context you either back out or you lose your will to continue being a territory holder. So I think masculine rivalry in many mammals has a spectacular and violent component, and this includes the human species. But in many cases, I think it's a more subtle kind of process of attrition. You can imagine a group of men in an Aboriginal hunter-gathering group, with some contest of superiority, in which all that happens is they, a particular pair start insulting each other, or a particular man who's previously had good relationships with the head honcho in the group starts just being disparaging, insulting, and disrespectful. That's a test, because that has a psychological effect, and if it dispirits and devitalizes the head honcho, that's a way of wearing him down, without actually having to engage in fisticuffs or violence.
Yeah.
Because the next time there's an infection or something like that, the guy will lose condition. So masculine antagonism is a lot more complicated than the classic idea of the two stags fighting to the death, or the two cage wrestlers trying to overcome each other through sheer physical prowess. It's much more interesting than that. Yeah.
No, wonderful. Thanks. Should we continue?
Yes, please.
Like the one is giving the other a beady eye.
It does indeed. It does indeed. Yes, it does indeed. But I'd be very surprised if the brain of the common hippopotamus is wired in such a way that they're reading much into each other's eyes.
Okay.
They're not particularly visual creatures. I mean, yes, their eyes are mounted in such a way that they clear the water, but the eyes are rather small relative to the size of the animal.
Yeah.
And they have such a large rostrum, such a large muzzle, that you can easily imagine that there's quite a lot of olfactory epithelium in there, giving them a pretty strong sense of smell. They also have tiny little ears, but that's also misleading, because it's well known that the common hippopotamus hears fabulously underwater, and probably the lower jaw, the bone of the lower jaw, is transmitting sound waves to the inner ear bones.
Right.
So the fact they have these tiddly little ears does not in any way imply that they have poor hearing. I think they have superb hearing, partly because they live a lot underwater, and water transmits sound so much more than air does.
Yeah.
So the world of hippopotamus is a noisy world with a lot of vocal versatility, and the small ear pinnae in the animal are completely misleading in that context.
Okay. Does have some bleeding in the mouth, it seems, so they may well have been fencing.
Yes, that's right. You can see in this juxtaposition here how easy it would be for one of them to cheat and just to take the whole upper jaw of its antagonist into its mouth and bite viciously into it, which would be quite serious.
Yeah.
But they seem to have a built-in inhibition to do that. It's kind of ironic, because that would be the obvious way in which you'd think they would use their canines, but
yeah.
I doubt whether that bleeding you see in the individual on the right was produced that way. I think it's more from the fencing with the incisors.
Okay. So it really is a show of bravado. Neither of them want to use their teeth here to injure the other, is my sense of it, based on our discussion. Would you agree?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true, but it could be even more subtle than that, because that is very interesting to have such ferocious canine teeth. I mean, really
Yeah.
spectacular canine teeth, and to have a kind of a neurological inhibition in which it's absolutely verboten to use those teeth as in the way that a carnivore would.
Yeah.
But it's even more interesting to think that much of the standoff could actually be at the level of just swapping smells and sounds.
Yeah.
And settling, basically coming to the conclusion based on the information that's generated that way. Look at this particular final frame. Are those two individuals top right? Are they the ones we've been looking at before?
Yes. And there are four in the water that are watching them,
Yeah,
listening
right.
to them.
Yes.
And then the other two came out of the water to investigate as well.
Right.
We've got some new birds in the frame, the Egyptian geese in the background, and there was also a green shank in the earlier part of the clip, which is an unusual bird to get in midwinter. Sometimes green shanks over winter. So it's been quite a birding experience, this video clip as well.
It has indeed. It has indeed. Yes. Yeah. Well, that was wonderful. Very enjoyable. Thank you.
Yeah, pleasure, Anthony. Thanks for discussing that fascinating biology. It's enjoyable now to look at hippos with so many different lenses that you've provided. Wonderful. I see the middle animal there has a whole lot of marks on him or her. Do you think that suggests it's a male that has had other males slashing at it, or do females sometimes get those marks as well?
I think females do. I think sometimes what happens is when conditions are crowded in the pool or in the river, then there's a certain amount of testiness and irascibility, and I think any member of the population can kind of slash at others with its lower canine teeth. It's a kind of a feature of hippopotamuses. You often see these vertical wounds on the torso.
Right.
But they seem to be able to heal from them most of the time. So, in fact, the strength of the immune system in a hippopotamus is one of its more interesting aspects. It's not in the same category as sharks, which are reputed never to get cancer. But the fact that hippos routinely defecate into their own waters, fertilizing their waters that way. So it's hardly a sterile environment.
Yeah.
And, a given individual can have literally dozens of these semi-bleeding lesions on the skin at any one time. And yet generally they seem to heal very quickly.
Interesting. There's perhaps a link to the spotted hyena. We once hypothesized that the false penis is a organ to test the immune system of the hyena. Perhaps we need another podcast on that topic.
Yes, that's interesting. Yeah. So, the bottom line, I think, is that even in a species as well known and in many ways prominent as the common hippopotamus, there's an awful lot that still remains to be discovered.
Well, look forward to exploring those further mysteries with you as the years play out. And thanks once again.
Well, thank you, Anthony, and to listeners and viewers, please like, subscribe, and share if you really do like the show. And until our next item here on Exploring the Bio Edge, we bid you good evening or good night, and over and out from us.
Cheers.